Now, we had two sessions really of meetings, and the topics range from strengthening multilateralism, ensuring food and energy security, development cooperation, and the second session was on counterterrorism, global skill mapping, humanitarian assistance and disaster response, as well as women-led development. Now the G20 ministers, after the discussions today and the negotiations which preceded it, we have agreed to issue a common position where the G20 as a group has come together and arrived at a consensus on many important issues. This has been adopted this afternoon as a chair's summary and outcome document. This would hold us in good stead as we move forward with other working group meetings of the presidency and, of course, in preparation for the summit which would take place in September. Now, what I'd like to do is really share some of the key takeaways from the outcome document and our discussions. These include, one, of course, the strong sentiment with G20 countries expressed on the need to strengthen multilateralism in the context of the dramatic changes in the global order. The G20 recognized in the context of the UN the essentiality of reforms and the need for reinvigorated multilateralism. Two, the important principles of international development cooperation, such as host country ownership, equal partnerships, tailoring such cooperation efforts with local needs. These were some aspects highlighted by the G20. They also touched upon the need for MDBs, the multilateral development banks, to mobilize additional financing and welcomed efforts to provide additional financing for sustainable development goals. The outcome document also stresses upon the need to have reliable food and fertilizer supply chains, as well as resilient and sustainable energy supply chains. In the context of global food and energy insecurity, this, we believe, is a very important message. I would also like to highlight that the foreign ministers unequivocally condemned terrorism in all forms and manifestations and recognized that all acts of terrorism are criminal and unjustifiable. They call for strengthening of efforts to deny safe havens to terrorist groups, freedom of operations, movement and recruitment, as well as financial, material, or political support. The G20 also reflected upon the threats arising from the misuse of new and emerging technologies and highlighted the importance of strengthening international cooperation in that regard. For the first time, the G20 foreign ministers considered and discussed the topic of counter-narcotics and called for inclusive and strong international cooperation in this regard. They also discussed the topic of global skills mapping, and this was in the context of the changing nature of work. They recognized that well-integrated, skilled workers benefit not only in their country of origin, but also the destination country where they may happen to be employed. The G20 also accepted the need to strengthen international cooperation in the field of humanitarian assistance and disaster risk reduction. This will be further discussed in the working group on this particular subject, which has been newly set up by the Indian presidency. Now, as you all know, women-led development is one of the key priorities of the Indian presidency, and it has been personally highlighted by the Prime Minister. After due deliberations on the G20 table, the foreign ministers affirmed the need to put gender equality and empowerment of women and girls, including their leadership, at the core of our efforts for inclusive recovery. Important discussions on global health were also held. The statement, the outcome document I'm talking about, highlights the need for strengthening key aspects of global health architecture, support for the pandemic fund, and continued political attention to global health. It stresses the need for implementing the One Health approach. The foreign ministers addressed climate action in the context of common but differentiated responsibilities and urged developed countries to fulfill their commitments to deliver on the goal of jointly mobilizing $100 billion per year urgently and through to 2025 to tackle climate change. Now, despite the challenges of the divergent positions on the conflict in Ukraine, the G20 foreign ministers were able to come to a consensus on addressing these key challenges that I have just mentioned. As the Prime Minister urged, we did indeed focus more on what unites us than what divides us. You would also see that it has been our endeavor to ensure that the voice of the Global South is heard on the G20 table. And that is why India had organized the Voice of the Global South Summit in January this year, in which I think 125 countries participated. So the agenda for the foreign ministers meeting, as well as the outcome document, has very clearly taken forward the priorities of the Global South. We are also particularly glad that to see so many of our friends and partners from the Global South on the table, because India, as President, had invited them. I would also like to point out that today's sessions commenced with a moment of silence to pay respect to those who lost their lives in the recent earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. Ahead of our deliberations in today's first session, as I told you, the Prime Minister gave his virtual address to the foreign ministers. I would like to take this opportunity to express my appreciation to all G20 members, to all the participating delegations, obviously to our own team working on it, for the support which they have given to the priorities of the presidency, for the efficient holding of today's meeting. We believe that the outcome document is truly a reflection of G20's commitment to face global challenges squarely and collectively. The G20 foreign ministers, along with the ministers from the guest countries and heads of delegations from international organizations, will be calling upon the Prime Minister very shortly, in fact, immediately after this press conference. So this really, in summary, is a sense of what was discussed today, what was negotiated amongst the G20 members, and the chair's summary and outcome document will, of course, be released in due course. So I think, Arindam, that should pave the way for questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir, for a detailed and comprehensive perspective, sir. Some ground rules before I open the floor for questions.